the number of participants coming in seems to be stabilizing. So let me say welcome properly then. Welcome. Thank you all for coming to this. So this is a webinar from Unlock Democracy. So you should all know where you are. My name's Jessica Metheringham, the chair of Unlock Democracy. We are going to be talking today about constituencies which represent those who are overseas, something we do not have in the UK, but many other countries do have. So this is a subject about which really many of us know very little. So I am here to learn along with everybody else. We are joined first of all by Celine, who works for Alexandre from the French Parliament, who represents some of these electors who are working overseas, living overseas, sorry. Celine, can I pass over to you to ask you to introduce yourself, first of all?
Thank you very much, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining and inviting Alexandre to this very interesting topic. So my name is Celine. I've been working for Alexandre really interesting to see how in Brussels at the French representation, and I've worked on subjects such as Brexit and the withdrawal agreement and the TCA as well. So working for Alexandre has been a very, very interesting other side of things, as I've seen how it is for French people who actually live in the UK and how these agreements have affected them. So it's the other face of a coin, because I've been on the side of making legislation basically, and now I am witnessing how it impacts people on the ground. I'm filling in for Alexandre. Hopefully he will join us later. However, he was stuck in the assembly as there was a very important government bill that was being voted on today regarding immigration, which is, I think, a subject that apparently the French and British care a lot about.
There are many problems on. I think it would be something to say that both governments talk a lot about it. But you said that the government had just been defeated, so he is stuck in the chamber at the moment, unfortunately. We know how that is. That happens here as well.
Yeah, really sorry about that. So you said you would like Alexandre to talk about the history of overseas constituencies in France?
Yes, just so first of all, fill us in a little bit about what is an overseas constituency? Who is he representing? Um, you know, so when did these constituencies come about, and how does his job fit in with those who are representing what we would consider the the sort of constituencies that we have, which are geographically, within the country being represented.
Right, so I will start with a little bit of history, because until 2008, French people living abroad were already represented in the French Parliament, which you may or not know, but is composed of two chambers as well. Both are elected, and French people abroad were only represented by senators. So nobody in the Assemblée was representing these people abroad, until there was this constitutional legislation that changed the law to create 12 constituencies for French MPs to represent French people living abroad, which started in 2012 with the legislative elections that took place that year, which was under François Hollande. Nicolas Sarkozy at the time. Since then, French people living abroad, as I was saying, have been represented by 12 different MPs. So the way it is constructed is the map is basically divided in 12 zones which lie on the basis of how many people are in these geographical zones, which is why Alexandre represents Northern Europe, which is small in terms of the area covered, but that's where a lot of French people live. So his constituency is comprises of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and the 3 Baltic states, and Iceland as well. Which represents, compared to other constituencies overseas, quite a homogeneous group, we could say, compared to, for example, another French overseas MP, which represents the whole of Asia and Oceania. Sorry, I'm not sure about the word, which is obviously culturally very, very various. So since 2012, these people are the French people living abroad are represented in the assembly as well. And how does it work? Well, to be able to vote in the election as a French person living abroad, you need to be registered in the what we call the liste électorale consulaire, which is the consular listings, which doesn't mean that all French people living abroad actually vote in the elections, because you can't vote if you're not registered. And if you take the case of the United Kingdom, for example, a lot of French people go there to London or other parts of the UK only to stay for a few months or have some working experience, or as a student. For example, myself, I went to study for a year at a university in the UK, and I did not register on the consular register, although I was there for a year. But you need to be on that list to be able to vote.
That makes perfect sense. So there are 12 of them who are representing the entire globe. This is of 577 seats in the assembly. Is that right? Or 570 something seats?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So there are only 12 of them who are representing the non-France areas of the globe, but there are 577 seats, is that right, in the assembly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's not very many of them. Do those 12 feel that they're a little bit, that they're a special grouping then? Do they end up working together a lot because they are different from the other assembly members?
Well, it's a very interesting question, but when you take the number of French people abroad, it's actually a smaller number, which is obvious, but that also explains why there are only 12 MPs for these people. And the way they work together, these 12 MPs, is not necessarily, they don't work as a group, as a political group. For example, Alexandre Lloyd is a member of the presidential party, and that, from my experience of working with him, it's been way more important in all the initiatives he's taken, or all the bills he's taken part of, than being representing French people in the UK, for example. But it's also very, it's something he has to deal on a very daily basis. In his office, we need to help French people who have problems with, for example, visas or their pensions. And to answer your question about whether these MPs work together, well, the thing is, it's not because these French people live abroad that they have the same problems. So it's not necessarily natural that they would always be engaged on the same issues.
So there may be some technical issues. You mentioned visas, where people may well be working, they'll have very similar problems. But I suppose it would be much the same that that the assembly members who are representing, say one area of Paris, may communicate more with each other, but not necessarily be representing the same issues or the same interests, because their constituents live side by side, But yeah, no, I completely see that. Of course. So what do you so France you said started this system 2007, 2008, you said it was. Why did they bring in this system? Why was there any sort of representation of this sort before?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you quite properly, but I think
Sorry.
the question was how did it come to be introduced, this
Yes.
this reform. So
Yes. How and
um,
why, I suppose. How and why?
why? Well, I think it didn't feel fair in a sense that only senators would represent French people living abroad, because the way senators are elected is not direct suffrage. Only, what we call in France grands électeurs vote for senators, which is basically elected people vote to then elect senators. So it was a way to make our democracy more direct, and for French people living abroad as well. I guess there was also inspiration from other countries that have this way of working. For example, Italy, although it's not exactly the same, it doesn't work exactly the same way, but it's something that also inspired the change. And French people living abroad, overseas, had been represented in the parliament since 46, sorry. So as you may know, that there were a lot of changes in our, well, we had a new constitution after World War II, and that was part of the changes that were introduced.
That's fair. That sounds very sensible. We would like a written constitution ourselves. This is one of the areas in which Britain is rather behind the rest of the world. Hmm. So when the elections come up, then it must be slightly different for those who are representing the areas which are geographically quite distant from France to go and campaign. What sort of campaigning does that look like? Presumably those members who are representing very large geographical areas, they won't simply get on a plane and just sort of fly around those areas, because some of those areas will be very large and very far away from France. So what does a campaign look like for someone who is representing so large and spread out an area?
Well, there's something that I didn't mention before, but which is quite important, because the French MP representing French people overseas is not the only elected member and the only one representing democracy, our democracy abroad. There are also 442 councillors who are elected by French people overseas. And these people, these elected councillors obviously play a huge role in the campaign and in the daily life of French people overseas. And the local party, the local activists also are very important for the campaign. They help to organize the journeys and travels to big cities. For example, Alexandre traveled all around the UK, but also other countries of the constituencies. What is very interesting is that in the UK, for example, most of French people are concentrated in London. But in Denmark, you don't have a lot of people, and Denmark is still a country where we count a lot of French. But Iceland, for example, doesn't have a big community, but the MPs campaigning would still go everywhere where they can meet with local actors and local activists. So yeah, I think, and of course, I forgot to mention embassies, the consulates, the French institutes. So all these actors on the territories are also very important. And the MP doesn't, it's not just the MP and its team. There is a very important network in all of the countries, and that's a big part of the campaign.
That network of councillors sounds most interesting. So do those people do they live within the country that they're representing generally? Do they live in France? Which is it?
They live in the country that they represent.
Mhm.
And what is very interesting, I think, is that they also play a part in what we call the Assemblée des Français de l'étranger, which is a French people overseas assembly. And all these councillors meet twice a year. I think it's twice a year. And they have their own commissions and discuss various topics. For example, we have a great councillor in the UK who sits on the renewable energy and transition committee. So these people also play a part, and the overseas MPs are always in contact with them and try to work together to relay the words and wishes of French people abroad.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Sorry, my internet connection keeps saying it's unstable. Sorry about that. So that sounds absolutely fascinating. Now, looking at the various questions we've had, the first question we had, which is from the Lib Dems France team, that is pretty much what you have answered just now, with perhaps a little bit more about, presumably this councillor network and the consul network. This is very useful for residents receiving information from the different candidates. So when it comes time for the elections, then that network plays a role there in presenting the different candidates to the voters there.
Right.
Moving on down the question. Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
No, it's just it's very important that, well, we try to motivate French people to actually register on these lists. Otherwise, they can't really participate in the democracy, and they're not inscribed on these lists forever. Their names are erased after 5 years. So if they're afraid or worried about their data being kept, they shouldn't, because it's really a way to help them and make sure they are integrated within the democratic community.
Thank you. There's another question which is about time limits for eligibility, which I think follows on from what you just said. So you said that that they'll be on there for 5 years. Can you renew after 5 years, presumably?
Oh yes, of course. You can renew when I think you will get an automatic message saying that if you want to stay on the register, you can renew your or like agree for your data to be kept.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you want
Now,
more. Sorry.
no, just to say that there's a follow-on as well, which is about the children. So supposing that that a French family move abroad, will their children, who perhaps may be born abroad and may grow up abroad, will they inherit French voting rights? Because I know that for the United States, for example, one can inherit voting rights, but only when the parent has lived there for a certain period of time. There are certain stipulations. For the United States, for example, you can pass on US citizenship when you yourself have lived within the US past the age of 14 for at least 2 years. So I imagine that there are other stipulations similar to that for passing on French voting rights.
Regarding the voting rights, they're kind of the same as citizenship. Basically, if you're French, wherever you've lived, you're going to be able to vote in the elections. Obviously, you need to be registered on a list. So if your parents are French and live abroad, then yes, when you turn 18, you are French by birth, so you are allowed to vote. But if your parents are not French and you live in France, if you've lived for a long enough period, then you get French citizenship at 18, and then you can vote. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Great.
That does, I think. Most of these, I think, there are specific, specific rules, and voting rights do not always go along with citizenship. We've seen in many places, there are many places where you can have citizenship but not be allowed to vote. There are also times, when you can be allowed to vote but not have citizenship. Voting for, local elections, for example. Okay, looking down the list of questions, and there are quite a lot of really interesting questions. Could you describe the registration process? So do people get the opportunity to vote? To register once per year? Do they get lots of letters sent out? Here in the UK, we regularly get letters sent to addresses just to check that the right person, the right people, that we're still on the register. So, does that happen abroad as well?
So as I was saying, abroad, the French consulate doesn't necessarily know of your presence in the UK, for example, if you haven't already registered. And the way to register is to there's a website. You go on the French diplomacy website, and there's a page where you can click on registering on the list, and then it's valid for 5 years. And I don't think they will send you letters, because the only data that they have is what you have given them. So for example, if it's only an email address, then they might send you an email after 5 years, but that's about it.
Less chasing than they might do otherwise. That does make perfect sense. Hello. We are joined by Alexander. Hello. Thank you for making the time. There were government votes, I understand. Oh, I'm afraid I can't hear you, which means I suspect that nobody else will be able to hear you. This, I think, is the cursed Zoom. Aha, I can hear you now.
Yes, I'm so sorry for being late. Unfortunately, we had a rather important vote, which we lost. So it's going to be an interesting few days. But anyway, that's another subject.
No, we understand this perfectly. This happens a fair amount here as well. People are called into the chamber, and suddenly something went perhaps not the way which was expected. So thank you very much to your assistant, Celine, who has been very helpful and has talked us through some of the processes, the processes around registration. What we haven't touched on so much has been perhaps the good that this has done, the benefits that have come from having these 12 assembly members. We've talked about some of the technical details, the fact that there's 12 of you, the places you represent, but I wonder if you could perhaps say a little bit about how this has benefited your constituencies, but also how it has benefited the assembly as a whole. What have the benefits been?
Yes, I think it's a key element, I think I would say, to defend the proposal. I think it's got two main sort of advantages. The first is that it maintains a bond between national institutions and citizens living abroad more effectively than any other mechanism that we've found, and a bond which is a window into national politics, which is a window into the evolving nature of the political debate domestically, which for those who live abroad for a long time might seem a bit distant after a while. And secondly, I think it brings added value to the debate in the National Assembly, because most of the members of Parliament representing the French who live abroad will have experience of other political debates in the countries of their constituencies. and might have a different view of particular subjects depending on those experiences. And actually their constituents will definitely have those experiences and definitely have views informed by those experiences. I saw that early on in the chat, I could see that there were questions about what the French living abroad are interested in. Are they divided sort of a right, left, and so forth? Actually, what you see quite clearly in the vote of the French living abroad is that they're very influenced by the country they live in and by the political debate, the nature of the political debate of the country they live in. So those who will live in more social, democratic side of the European Union will tend to have those views a bit more affirmed than those who will live in maybe more liberal countries in economic terms will tend to be more on the sort of economically liberal side. So you can see that it brings a wealth of sort of experience and a different look or outlook on topics which are universal. I mean, when you think about sort of climate change policy, immigration policy, and so forth, they're issues which are pretty standard in any Western democracy. And so I think it brings something to the debate in the National Assembly to have that experience brought to it.
Excellent. So the 12 of you come from different political parties, but also bring different things to the assembly. That sounds like a very sensible thing to do. Just looking down some of the other questions, because there have been quite a lot of questions, because this is something that we simply don't have. One of the things that Celine mentioned, which seemed particularly important, was this local councillor network, and how that supported you from the countries that they were in. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because it feels like that's an important part of this. We can't just go along and say, oh, let's have some members of parliament, who are representing constituencies abroad. It feels as though we need this support in place beforehand. So yes, how does that network work? What does it do to support you?
So there, I think I wasn't there for the conversation with Celine, but I think there's a bit of a distinction to have, which is a difference, which is born from the different system between the French and English system. There are 12 senators representing the French who live abroad and 11 MPs, and the senators are elected by those people, but the MPs aren't. So when it comes to the Senate, the equivalent of our House of Lords, our House of Lords is essentially elected by councils, mayors, what we call grand electors, and which are basically locally elected officials. And when the senators representing the French abroad were created, well, you had to find a pool of voters for them. And so at that point, this is a bit of a shortcut in history, but were created those, what would be the equivalent of our local councils abroad, which are a list system where you elect local representatives. So there will be in a much smaller constituencies than members of parliament. And they will be all over the globe. There'll be some in London, some in Abidjan, some in everywhere. And they, without going in again in the complexities, they are spread across the world, and there is a bonus for areas where there are lots of French. So they're a bit representative of the French population, but not completely. They're supposed to represent the diversity of the communities rather than their actual numbers. They are essential in parts for the job they do on a daily life, where they're in contact, obviously, with constituents, but also because they then in turn elect the senators. The MPs get elected directly by our constituents, so it's a bit different. Now, as you know, any MP will have with council members in his constituency, by definition, those who are of the same political party will be closer, and he will have a relationship with them. I would expect it to be the same in any constituency in the UK, but they're less vital to the role of the representation in the Chambre des Députés, the House of Commons, than in what are our equivalent of the House of Lords, where obviously if you have that system, you need to find a way to select the people who enter, and that's the way which was chosen back then. And I could, do you want me to,
that
do you want me to
seems
continue? I can see a question about the responsibilities, and I can go a bit more into
was
detail.
what I was going to get on to, in fact. You were very much on the same wavelength. So yes, do carry on in that vein, please.
So, without going too much into the complexities of the system, there are two types of overseas councillors. Some of them have only the responsibility of voting for the senatorial election. They are the ones who are lower down the lists when the elections happen. The proper, what we would call the proper councillors, so the councillors themselves, have a list of other responsibilities which are very local. For instance, they sit on a committee, the committee around the consulate, treating things like scholarships for local schools, for French schools. They will have responsibilities linked to providing day-to-day advice to French citizens abroad. And I'm very cautious not to go in to go in this because it's a very complex system. Then they will also elect an assembly called the Assembly Representing the French Abroad, which gathers in Paris every 6 months for a week to discuss issues concerning the French who live abroad. So just to be clear, there is a local election. It's a list system.
Mm-hmm.
Those at the top of the list who obviously get the votes become councillors. They in turn elect both a few of them as members of the assembly, 150 of them as members of those assembly, and the senators. And they have local responsibilities. And then those who are further down the list, who might be called on to replace them, as some of them might resign, or like any list system, only vote for the senatorial. Is that clear? I realize it can be a bit daunting.
That is, I think, as clear as it, probably as clear as it is going to get without extensive diagrams. But I think it is actually fairly clear, that this is a system which hasn't just been thought up of saying, let's have someone representing those who live abroad. This is a system which is actually deeply embedded in it and says, how are we going to do this properly? There is a question there from John. It's sort of, towards the top, perhaps a third of the way down, which is about, how you can see that people who are living abroad temporarily, perhaps in short-term postings, might require representation. But would it be better? So this is probably John playing devil's advocate. Definitely me playing devil's advocate here. Would it not be better for them to become, more engaged with the new country in which they live? Supposing that somebody has lived somewhere for 20 years, would it not be better for them to become part of that country? What's the argument, to say that they should continue to have representation with the country that they came from?
Well, first, I think it's not mutually exclusive. I have lots of constituents who are very involved in British or Danish politics. Just like it's not mutually exclusive to be involved in, European politics and domestic politics. So first, I don't think the fact that you are following and interested in the becoming of your country of origin and your country of nationality is in itself exclusive from the fact that you are interested in your country where you reside, where you live. Secondly, I think it goes back to a philosophical concept of what is citizenship. We judge that the citizenship belonging to the French community, whether you live for 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years, you remain a French citizen. If something happens to you abroad, the French state will go and help you. It won't make a judgment call on how old your passport is. It will go and help you. So during COVID, we evacuated people who were very ill from very remote places. When there are security problems, hostage situations, we don't question whether somebody has been living abroad for 1 year, 5 years, or 50 years. He's a French citizen. I think it's true that French citizens living abroad for a long time might become disinterested in certain political issues. And so they will be less interested, and it relates a bit to the case, to the question about the typical case, sort of typical case of an overseas constituency MP. They will move away from some sort of day-to-day politics, which might concern more a French living in France. So if you think of a French MP living in France, big subject will be social housing. Even though it's not really in his responsibility, he'll get lots of demand about social housing. It's obvious that as a French living abroad, you don't get lots of demand on social housing because it's obviously a competency of the country you live in. But they will be very interested in some of the key debates that there are in the French Parliament. There have been debates at the moment about, changing the constitution to put climate elements into it, changing the constitution to put elements linked to the right of abortion into the constitution. There have been conversations. We just had a bill which the vote we just lost about an immigration bill. Those are issues that people who live very far away can have very strong opinions in one way or the other about. And when they are born or when they obtain the French nationality, they enter a community who decides and believes that its destiny is decided by the totality of the community, whether it lives in France or not. So, yeah, I don't think it's mutually exclusive at all to entertaining a healthy relationship to the democracy you move into.
No, absolutely. Would you say that most people in France share your opinion? Were there dissenting voices saying that those living abroad shouldn't have votes? Because this can be a contentious issue here in the UK.
So the senators have been there for a long time. The MPs, it's a more recent debate, so that there was a big debate about it. The cynics will say that there was a big debate centered about what people projected those MPs would be in terms of political color. You've got to see that this reform was made when we were in a bipolar world with the right against the left. And so there was a huge amount of speculation of whether the constituencies would be right-leaning or left-leaning and how you would cut them. And there was concern very clearly amongst the left that they would be sort of entrenched conservative constituencies. And the interesting thing is that in every election since then, they have they have never voted in their majority for the right-wing parties. So it turned out to be quite a mistaken case of mistaken interpretation. So there was a debate around that. And yes, there is a debate from time to time about the link between taxation and representation. But again, I think it goes to the philosophy of what we consider political representation to be. We considered about a century and a half ago that should be separated from taxation. And that if you live in France and you don't pay tax, you still get to choose and to vote. And there's no reason why the fact that you go and live for 2 years or 4 years in Brussels or in London would mean that you're not entitled anymore to choose the people who will govern your country.
That part of what you said there leads very nicely to the last question. Well, not the last one I'm going to ask, but the last one on the list, which is about whether people from marginalized groups get elected under the system. Because you said that there was a fear that all of the people being elected here may be very entrenched conservative groups, and that turned out not to be the case. Does it turn out to be the case that not just the senators, not just the assembly members, but also perhaps the councillors, that first level, do they turn out to be people who might come from marginalized groups, from those who are less represented than other groups?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by marginalized group. Local councillors will tend to be people who are quite active in their communities. I mean, eventually it's a local election with a relatively low turnout and so a relatively small number of people voting. And so the people who are very active in their communities will tend to be elected. And this is a broad generalization because obviously there is over 500 of them. But by the by, you will see that people who are involved in their schools and people who are involved in, the everything related to the relationship between France and the host country will tend to be those who formulate the desire and then eventually win the elections to get elected. As if you live, if you're very
By
removed from the
marginalised
French
groups, I
community.
think that what was meant there was fewer white male.
Fewer white males.
Sorry,
males,
I'm afraid my internet is terrible
yeah,
there.
No.
White male, yes.
So males definitely, I mean, males by the same standard. I mean, when we got elected in 2017, the new party of Emmanuel Macron, we increased, I think, the level of feminization in the assembly by about 20 percentage points. We were 50-50, more or less. I mean, not more than less, I mean, we were 50-50. And that made the assembly close to 50-50. And for the French living abroad, I'm trying to, the members of parliament, I'm trying to think, but I think out of 11 MPs, there were 10 who were elected from the majority, and half of them were women, I think, in the first term. We lost a couple of them in the second term, but both male and female. So in terms of male and female, I think for the French living abroad, that's really not a topic. It's probably more a topic of selecting candidates than a topic of running in elections. When I ran in the seat in Northern Europe, just trying to think to make sure that I don't say something inaccurate, but the vast majority of my opposing candidates were women. Nearly all of them, actually, in the first race, at least all the main ones. So in terms of male and female gender, I think that's not an issue. In terms of community, I think there is a question that might arise. The constituencies have been cut in a way which should preclude one country from dominating completely all the others, if you see what I mean. So one community in one place dominating all the other communities in the constituency. Which could become an issue theoretically, depending on how you cut the countries. You could have a country which is very dominant. In terms of white males of origin, we have a diverse representation. I mean, of the 11 representatives, Amiguel Akrafi, who's elected in Eastern Africa, will have some origins, I think, in Lebanon. An opposing member will have origins in North Africa. The member for the constituency group Israel will have origins in Israel. I mean, there's a broad variety of origins, but I mean, they're all French citizens. But if you go back to their grandparents, you will find people who have come from those countries. Yeah.
Thank you. We're getting towards the end of this. So I'm just picking out a few more questions here. I mean, firstly, there's one question about what subjects your constituents generally contact you about. So Deborah has asked, what are the top 3 subjects? You know, what do you usually get contacted about? Clearly not social housing, but possibly things to do, you know, with constitutional change.
Well, I would say that I've had 2 temporary but very important subjects in my constituency, which I think most of you will be familiar with, which were a huge source of work and caseload, which was Brexit, and obviously the concerns of about 250,000 French people who lived in the UK and were concerned about their rights. So I was elected in 2017, so just in after the referendum and throughout the negotiations, obviously there was a huge source of concern, and about as many life stories and cases as you can imagine, entangled between 1, 2, or sometimes multiple countries, and how Brexit impacts that. So it was a temporary, but a 4 or 5 years. That was I would say the majority of the cases that came out. Secondly, there was COVID, which there again, people living across borders were incredibly targeted by COVID restrictions, or their lives were particularly disrupted by COVID restrictions. So they were fundamentally disrupted inside countries, but for those who were living in different countries than their families and so forth, that was obviously a enormous subject for 2 years. In sort of normal times, if you'll allow me that expression, in sort of non-pandemic and non-decision to leave the EU time. You have questions about taxation come up a lot. There are some taxes on the French who live abroad. There are particular types of taxes. There are particular types on French. So there are questions about taxation. There are lots of questions about healthcare. There's lots of questions about access to healthcare, what conditions, and so forth. Sorry. There are conditions about mobility. Mobility to and from the countries a lot. And then there are a host of questions about people who encounter difficulties in their life abroad. And that might be divorces, it might be difficult questions related to children stuck between jurisdictions. And the problems of my constituents tend to be particularly difficult to solve. Because they're already difficult to solve in a normal case for a normal MP, but here you generally have problems who are stuck between two laws, two countries, two judicial systems, and that can, or often does, or tax systems, and that often complexifies things quite significantly or substantially. And then one of the very important issues which comes up a lot, but which is a bit particular to France, is that we have a whole network of French schools abroad, which are really French schools run by the government, with teachers from our Minister of National Education and so forth and so forth. And so everything around those schools, which are the same issues that you might see around the constituency MP and the school and the big school in this constituency, will happen in our constituency. So, you know, scholarships, access to disabled students, whatever the life of a school, the normal, natural life of a school is.
Yeah. So I imagine that a lot of those do center on the fact that somebody is essentially talking about two different legal systems. You know, you were talking about, you know, stuck between jurisdictions there, you know, and I imagine that those would, you know, happen quite a lot. Thinking about that, do most French citizens who are living abroad, do they register to vote? So, well, actually the question is, you know, do you know where, you know, what percentage of French citizens living abroad who are registered to vote for France? Is it most of them, or do you think it's, you know, a relatively small number?
That's very difficult to say. I mean, it's definitely not all of them, and that's very difficult to say. Also, it's difficult to say because it's not I mean, you might have people who work abroad for a month or 2 months. So if I think of my constituency, all the constituencies might be different. My constituency, which is very peculiar, especially before Brexit, because a constituency inside the EU, so it's very easy to move around. There are low risks to your life if you move to, you know, Scandinavia or the UK. It's very different from if you move to a country with significant risks, I don't know, Afghanistan or something. So it's very easy for a French person to go and do an internship, to a youngster to go and work for a bar in a bar for 6 months and so forth. And so it's easy to speculate that a lot of them will have not registered. And there's a lot of French people in my constituency, about 200,000, but you could easily speculate that there's another 100,000 who might be there for a small amount of time and won't register. Keep in mind that if they don't register in the constituency at all, that means they're still registered in France and they can still vote where they left being registered in France. Yeah. So for their original MP. So, and that will change depending on the constituencies, because obviously constituencies which include countries where access to the labor market is restricted by visa restrictions and so forth, will have less of those people or less of those French citizens who might easily go and settle for a few months, a few years without registering. Then there is a second thing to keep into account, which is the turnout. The turnout out of the people who are registered is very low, objectively. It's in line with turnouts in very difficult neighborhoods in France. It has gone up significantly at the last election because for the first time we instated electronic voting. Before, it was a manual vote, so you had to move to go and vote. And that's
what does electronic voting mean in this circumstance?
It means voting online.
So does that mean that you vote online? Right.
Yeah. And so for the first 2 elections, that was impossible.
Okay.
And that's a huge challenge if you want to put that system in place, because you need to have voting booths abroad, people to man them, then people who live away from those voting booths. So you might have some in London because it's fairly easy. There's a very big community. So you'll find the volunteers, you'll find the places. But if you live in Birmingham or if you live in Brighton, that means you have to travel back and forth. And you have to remember, in the last elections, what has happened is the presidential election and the parliamentary election have been just back to back. And they're both 2-round elections, and they all happen on a Sunday. So you're talking first Sunday, first round presidential election, second Sunday, second round presidential election, third Sunday, first round parliamentary election, fourth Sunday, fourth round. So asking people in the middle of May or June to spend 4 Sundays in a row queuing to vote for elections is not the most popular demand you can make to citizens. So the move to an electronic voting nearly increased by 10% the participation rate, and this was the first time. So I would have quite a good hope that over time we would be able to increase that substantially. Will we one day match the type of average turnout that you have in France? Probably difficult, objectively, but we should aspire to it.
No. Excellent. One last question before we wrap this up, but we've concentrated very much on how the citizens vote, how they cast their vote, how they are represented. But there are a couple of questions which have been asked around how the government considers them, when the departments, when they're looking at these voters, were they counted, by being a special overseas department? Were they counted as if they're in metropolitan France? How are they incorporated into the larger system? That's probably a terrible way of paraphrasing it.
No. I think very well. I mean, if you think of the French overseas, we have 11 MPs at the moment. And one of them is the Minister of Industry. One of them is the chair of the European Affairs Committee. I am the chair of the largest French financial institution, public financial institution. So we all have relatively important roles in the sort of in the functioning of a parliamentary group and in the functioning of government, which hints, I'm not saying that as sort of bragging rights, it hints that sort of integration has gone quite well. The French living abroad, the MPs of the French living abroad, are not treated as sort of different species and sort of put on the side and so forth. No, they're fully integrated and they've occupied very significant roles, including at the moment the Minister of Industry. When it comes to the voters, it's a huge pool of vote and it makes a huge difference. First, we just lost a vote right now, 5 minutes ago, and we were missing 2 votes. So 11 seats is a lot of seats. And in a tight election, that makes a real difference. And so the seats are competitive. And then for the presidential election, that's nearly 1 million voters abroad. That's a lot of voters. That can make a huge difference in a national election. If you think of an election which is very tight, 49-51 second round, you can make the difference by winning the vote of the French who live abroad. So, the president in his 2017 campaign came to London. I organized with a few others his trip to London, and we had a public meeting in London, just in front of Westminster, with nearly 4,000 French people living in London. Sarkozy, the President Sarkozy in 2012 had come to campaign in London. The president went to New York and campaigned in New York. He went to Brussels and campaigned in Brussels. So yes, those communities are important. Now, obviously, they're more important to certain candidates than to others. Because the French living abroad, for instance, politically, tend not to vote for the far right, for instance. There are a few exceptions, but overwhelmingly, they tend not to vote for the far right. And so far right candidates who have all borne the name Le Pen in the last 40 years haven't been known to campaign a lot outside France. But if you take my constituency in London, in the last year, we have had, the former French president, François Hollande, who's been over for book signings. We've had the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, who's been over to book signing. It is a regular passage. And that's in part because you obviously have 100,000 voters who are there. It's quite something which is quite hard to ignore.
No, I can imagine. Thank you for speaking to us this evening. This is, this has been absolutely fascinating. Quite a lot of new information for me, new information, I think, for many of our listeners, because this is not a system that we have. So it is interesting